No healer could save dying Lycan King until the poor widow did the impossible. The moonlit mountains stretched like silver daggers across the horizon, their peaks sharp against the night sky. A thin mist curled around the jagged cliffs, whispering secrets only the wind could hear. In the deepest shadow of the tallest peak, a castle rose, dark and imposing, its towers sharp as talons, its windows like hollow eyes staring into the wilderness. Within those walls, the Lycan king lay dying. The court was in chaos. Courtiers and servants moved like frantic shadows across the cold stone floors, their faces pale and eyes wide with fear. The royal healers, the finest in the kingdom, hovered around the king's bed, their hands trembling as they mixed potions and whispered incantations. But nothing worked. Every spell fizzled into smoke, every potion evaporated before it could touch his skin. He was the Lycan king, feared across the lands for his strength, his power, and his unyielding will. He had commanded armies, conquered enemies, and ruled with wisdom and iron alike. And yet, here he was, pale and still, bleeding from a wound that no skill or magic could mend. His breath came shallow, a ghost of its former strength, and even the moonlight streaming through the stained glass seemed unable to touch him. In the corner of the chamber, a figure watched silently. She was small, dressed in plain clothes that had seen better days, her hands calloused from work that demanded more strength than most nobles could imagine. A widow, she was known in her village for her quiet life, tending to her small home and garden after losing her husband to illness years before. No one here had ever imagined she would stand in a royal chamber, where nobles whispered about curses, betrayals, and the end of a kingdom. Yet she had come, drawn not by fear, not by ambition, but by a dream that had haunted her nights for weeks. In the dream, the king's face had appeared, pale and shadowed, and his voice had called to her, soft and urgent. She had no idea why, but she had followed, walking for days through forests and mountains until she reached this castle. "Who is she?" one of the junior healers whispered, fear and suspicion twisting her voice. "She is just a peasant," another replied. "What could she possibly do that we, trained for years in the healing arts, cannot?" But the widow did not speak. She stepped closer to the king, her eyes fixed on his pale face. She had not brought any magic, no potions, no tools. Only her hands, steady and warm, and a courage born from necessity. She knelt beside the bed, taking his hand in hers, and let her heart guide her. The court gasped, the healers froze. The king's chest rose with a faint tremor as if the very act of her touch had stirred something deep within him. "Your Majesty," a healer said, voice tight, "you must not," but the king did not hear them. His eyes, half closed, fluttered with the shadow of a life clinging to the edges of darkness. And then something remarkable happened. A faint pulse, soft and silver, traveled through the widow's hands into the king. It was like moonlight captured in flesh, gentle and impossible. He coughed, and the sound was weak but real. The color returned to his cheeks, pale though it remained, and his lips moved, forming words too soft for anyone else to hear. The widow leaned closer. "It's all right, my king," she whispered. "You are not alone. You will not die tonight." For a moment the world seemed to hold its breath. The healers stared, the courtiers whispered, and even the shadows of the chamber seemed to lean in, watching. The king's eyes opened fully, and for the first time in days the fire in them flickered, not with anger but with recognition. "Who?" he breathed, his voice hoarse, but it carried the weight of centuries. "I am just a woman who could not ignore your call," she replied softly, bowing her head in humility. He tried to sit up, but weakness pinned him to the bed. The widow supported him with her arms, steady and sure. In that moment, he felt a strange warmth, a connection that went beyond healing. It was as if her presence alone had begun to mend more than flesh. It reached into the shadows of his soul, into the loneliness that had been his companion for centuries. The courtiers murmured behind their hands. Some were afraid, some were in awe, and some whispered of witchcraft. But no one could deny the truth. The Lycan king, once thought beyond saving, was alive. Night deepened, and the castle seemed to breathe in rhythm with the king's pulse. The widow remained by his side, refusing to leave even as the courtiers tried to escort her out. She felt the weight of the room, the heavy tension, and yet she did not falter. "Why you?" one of the healers finally asked, unable to contain curiosity and envy. The widow looked at the king, who met her gaze with something that was neither command nor question but recognition. "I do not know," she said simply, "but I know I could not stand aside." The king tried to speak again, but words failed him. He reached for her hand, gripping it with a strength he had not known he possessed. A single tear slid down the widow's cheek, but she did not pull away. Outside, the wind howled through the mountains, rattling the castle walls. In that storm, the world seemed to shift, as if recognizing the impossible miracle that had just occurred. For centuries, kings and queens, healers and shamans had tried and failed to save him. And yet here in the quiet strength of a poor widow, life returned. Hours passed like minutes. The king, still weak, finally spoke, his voice gaining strength with each word. "You saved me." "How?" The widow shook her head. "I cannot explain. Perhaps it was fate. Perhaps it was the moon, but you are alive, and that is what matters." He studied her, his mind racing with thoughts and questions. He had known power, fear, loyalty, and betrayal. He had known love, yes, but also loss beyond measure. And now, in the face of death, he had discovered something new, trust, pure and unspoken, in someone entirely unexpected. A faint smile touched his lips, but it was quickly replaced by concern. "They will not accept this," he said quietly. "The court, the council, they will see you as a threat. They will try to harm you." The widow's grip on his hand tightened. "Let them try. I will not leave you. Not now. Not ever." He studied her for a long moment, the flickering torchlight painting shadows across his scarred face. And in those shadows, he saw something he had never seen before: hope. The chamber door creaked, and a cold voice broke the fragile calm. "Your Majesty," one of the chief counselors said, stepping forward with a scowl, "we must know who this woman is. Her presence here—" "Enough," the king interrupted, his voice still weak but firm. "She stays. She saved me when no healer could. That is reason enough." The court fell silent, unsure whether to respect the king's words or challenge them. The widow lowered her eyes, feeling the weight of their gaze, but also a quiet pride. She had done the impossible, and the king had lived. Night passed into dawn. The first rays of sunlight pierced the windows, painting the chamber in gold and silver. The Lycan king slept, finally at peace, his breathing steady. The widow watched him, her heart heavy with emotions she could not name. Relief, fear, awe, and an inexplicable connection stirred within her, a bond that felt eternal. As the castle began to stir with the activity of a new day, rumors would already be spreading. The king alive, saved by a widow from nowhere. People would call it a miracle, others would whisper of dark magic, and some would seek to destroy her. But none of that mattered. What mattered was the pulse of life that returned to the king's chest, the warmth of his hand in hers, and the spark of destiny that had brought them together. And as she sat there, holding his hand, a whisper of wind moved through the chamber, carrying a single truth. This was only the beginning. The world would not easily accept their bond, and the shadows that sought to claim the king were far from defeated. The widow closed her eyes for a moment, letting herself feel the full weight of what had just happened. She had done the impossible. And yet deep inside, a quiet fear stirred. What would be required of her next, in a kingdom full of power, betrayal, and secrets older than the mountains themselves? When the king stirred in his sleep, his eyes fluttering open to the pale light, the widow leaned closer. "Rest now, my king," she whispered. "Tomorrow we face whatever comes together." Outside, the moonlit mountains glimmered under the silver glow, a silent witness to a bond that had begun with fear, hope, and the impossible. Somewhere in the distance, A shadow moved, watching the castle, waiting for the moment to strike. And in that silent, golden morning, the first chapter of a story that would shake kingdoms, hearts, and destinies had begun. One that would test courage, loyalty, and love beyond measure. The dying Lycan king had been saved. But the true trials, the kind that touched the soul and the heart, were only just beginning. The castle was quiet, but the air hummed with tension. The Lycan king, still weak from his near death, sat in the high chamber, wrapped in thick blankets. His golden eyes, sharp even in weakness, scanned the room. The widow remained close, her small frame a silent shield at his side. Courtiers lingered in the shadows, whispers curling like smoke around the tall stone walls. Some watched with envy, others with fear, and a few with awe. The king's survival was a miracle, but the one who had saved him, someone so humble, so ordinary, was an enigma none of them could understand. "Your Majesty," one of the senior counselors began, voice trembling, "you are recovering, but the kingdom, the clans, they will question your judgment. Allow me to speak with the council. This woman—" "Do not speak," the king interrupted, his voice quiet but firm. The command, though gentle, carried the weight of centuries. "She saved me when all others failed. That is reason enough. She remains by my side." The widow bowed her head slightly, feeling the heat of 1,000 eyes upon her. She did not need to speak. The king's trust in her was enough. Yet even she could feel the burden of the invisible chains around them, the expectations, the jealousy, the unspoken threats. For days she stayed in the castle, tending to the king, who was slowly regaining strength. Every movement, every word, carried a weight neither of them could deny. Though the king no longer teetered on the edge of death, he remained fragile, and each small act of healing revealed a deeper connection between them. It was as if the king's body responded not only to her touch but to her very presence. Late one night the king woke with a start, his eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. The widow, seated nearby, immediately rose to his side. "You are awake," she said softly, taking his hand. "Did you dream?" He nodded, his gaze distant. "I saw shadows, not enemies but memories, faces of those I have lost, centuries of battles, and yet I also saw you." The widow's heart skipped. "Me," she whispered. "Yes," he said, voice barely above a breath. "Your face. Your hands, something guided me back from the edge. I do not understand it, but I feel it still, even now." She could not explain it either. There was something ancient within her, a power she had never fully understood. Something that connected her to the king, to the moon, and to a magic older than the mountains themselves. She had always thought her life was ordinary, shaped by loss and hardship, but now she sensed that her destiny was entwined with his. Days passed and the king grew stronger. He walked through the halls, leaning on the widow's steady arm. The castle, usually filled with fear and whispers, felt different in her presence. The shadows seemed less oppressive, the cold stone less severe. Yet the court watched with suspicion. One afternoon, as the sun poured through tall windows, a messenger arrived from a neighboring clan. His words were cautious but urgent. The rival Lycan factions were moving. They had heard of the king's weakness and his miraculous recovery and saw an opportunity to strike. The king listened silently, his jaw tight. "We will not show weakness," he said finally. "We cannot afford it, not now. And you," his golden eyes met the widow's. "You will stay close. Do not leave my side. I cannot risk losing you." The widow nodded, though a chill ran down her spine. Danger lurked closer than they had imagined, and her role was no longer only to heal but to protect. That evening she sat beside the king in the highest tower, where the moonlight painted silver patterns across the floor. They were quiet, two souls bound by an invisible thread. "You fear them," the king said suddenly, his voice soft, almost vulnerable. "Do you?" She considered the question. "I fear what might happen if I fail you," she admitted. "But I also know I cannot turn away, not when you are here, not when this is happening." He studied her, noting the strength in her words, the courage in her heart. He had faced countless enemies, seen betrayal and treachery in every corner, yet there was something about her that defied fear itself. Something about her presence made him feel alive in a way he had not felt for centuries. A week later, news arrived that a small group of assassins from a rival clan had infiltrated the outskirts of the castle grounds. The king and his guards prepared for battle, but the widow insisted on accompanying him. "You are still weak," one of the generals argued. "It is not safe. I will not sit behind walls while he faces danger alone," she said firmly. "I saved his life once. I will not let it end here." The king looked at her, admiration and worry mingling in his golden eyes. "Very well," he said quietly. "Stay close. Trust in yourself as I trust in you." They rode through the moonlit forest together, the wind whipping past them, the shadows of trees stretching long and dark. The widow's hands gripped the reins tightly, yet her heart pounded not with fear but with resolve. She could feel the king's energy beside her, a silent rhythm that matched her own heartbeat. The assassins struck swiftly, their blades glinting in the pale light. But the king, though weakened, moved with a speed and power that took them by surprise. And the widow, though untrained in combat, moved with an instinctive grace, stepping between the king and danger, her hands emanating a strange warmth that seemed to repel the attackers. When the skirmish ended, the forest quiet again except for the rustling leaves, the king looked at her with something like awe. You saved me again," he whispered, voice heavy with emotion. She shook her head. "I did not save you alone. We faced this together, always." Back at the castle, their bond became impossible to ignore. Whispers circulated. The Lycan king, once untouchable and feared, was now linked to a widow from nowhere. Some called it magic, others called it fate, and a few dared to call it scandal. But the king did not care for whispers, and the widow, she did not care for fear. Yet the connection between them was deeper than either had expected. At night, the king would wake and find her watching over him, her eyes reflecting the moonlight. And when she looked into his golden gaze, she felt the pull of a destiny that could not be denied. But not all forces were content to watch silently. Shadows moved within the castle, whispers of envy and malice. One of the senior counselors, a man whose loyalty had always been conditional, began to plot. The widow, though innocent, had upset the balance of power. The king's near death had left cracks in the castle's politics, and those cracks were wide enough for ambition to seep through. Late one night, as the widow sat beside the king in the chamber, she sensed movement. A figure passed silently in the corridor outside. She rose and pressed herself against the wall, heart hammering. The king noticed her tension immediately. "Something is wrong," he said, voice low. "I thought I saw someone," she admitted, keeping her tone steady. "Perhaps a servant or someone from the council." The king nodded, but his eyes narrowed. "Do not fear shadows," he said, "but do not ignore them either. If someone seeks to harm you or me, they will find that we are ready." And so the castle held its breath. The Lycan king, though healing, remained vulnerable. The widow, though brave, was still learning the depth of her own power. And in the shadows, envy and ambition moved like predators, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Yet even as danger grew closer, the connection between them deepened. The king, who had known loneliness for centuries, felt a spark of something unfamiliar: trust, admiration, and perhaps the first stirrings of love. And the widow, who had lost everything in her life, felt a purpose and belonging she had never known. The moon rose higher, casting a silver glow through the castle towers. In that quiet, magical light, they stood together by the highest window, looking out over the mountains. "The world is changing," the king said softly, "and so are we. But if we stand together, nothing can break us." The widow held his hand, feeling the pulse of life she had helped restore, and whispered, "Then we will face it together, no matter what comes." The wind whispered through the towers, carrying a hint of distant danger and a promise of trials yet to come. For the king was healed, but the kingdom was still fragile. Shadows of betrayal, envy, and magic lingered, and the widow's power, mysterious and untested, would soon be tested in ways neither of them could yet imagine. And as the first silver rays of dawn touched the moonlit mountains, a quiet truth settled over the castle. This was only the beginning. The Lycan king was alive, but the story of their bond, their power, and the destiny they shared had just begun. Outside in the distant forests, figures watched the castle, their eyes glinting with plans and intentions. And somewhere, far beyond the reach of the moon, the first threads of a new threat began to weave themselves into the night. The widow turned to the king, and in his golden gaze she saw a reflection of her own courage. "Whatever comes," she whispered, "we face it together." He nodded, and for the first time in centuries, the Lycan king felt a flicker of peace, though he knew, deep in his heart, that true trials, the ones that would test their courage and love, were still waiting in the shadows. And so, under the silver moon, their journey continued, bound by trust, destiny, and the impossible miracle that had brought them together. The castle breathed quietly under the light of a silver moon, but the stillness was deceiving. Within the stone walls, whispers had begun to grow louder, curling through corridors like smoke. The Lycan king, though healed of the wound that had nearly claimed his life, sensed the tension in every shadow, the hidden glances of those who no longer saw him as invincible. And he knew, deep in his bones, that some of those shadows were watching the widow. She moved through the halls with quiet grace, carrying herself as if she belonged, though the noble's eyes often lingered on her with suspicion or envy. She had proven herself in ways no one could have imagined, saving the king when every healer failed, standing firm in the face of danger. But court politics were not so easily won. The whispers had turned into rumors. Who was she, really? What was her power? Why did the king trust her above all others? The king watched her closely, aware of how the castle seemed to shift whenever she was near. Her courage had saved him once, and her presence now soothed the endless ache of his solitude. Yet he sensed something deeper in her, a force he did not fully understand, something ancient and wild tied to the moon, to life itself. "Your Majesty," one of the generals said, bowing low, "there are reports from the northern borders. A faction of the rival clans gathers, and they are emboldened by your near death. If they strike now," his voice faltered, the unspoken threat heavy in the air. The king's golden eyes narrowed. "Then we strike first," he said, voice low and firm. "But not without her." He turned to the widow. "You will ride with me. I will not face them alone, and I cannot risk leaving you behind." Her heart pounded, but she did not hesitate. "I will stand with you," she said simply, her voice steady despite the fear that fluttered in her chest. The preparation for the journey was swift. The king, though not yet fully recovered, moved with strength and purpose. His soldiers, loyal and fierce, respected the widow for her courage. Yet even as they mounted their horses under the pale moonlight, the castle walls seemed to hold their breath, aware of the storm gathering beyond. The ride to the northern borders was long and tense. The widow felt the wind whip against her face, but her mind was focused entirely on the king, on the rhythm of his heartbeat, and the strange pulse of energy she could feel emanating from him. It was as if their souls had become linked in some subtle, unbreakable way. When they arrived, the sight of the rival clan encampment was enough to make even seasoned warriors tense. Torches flickered against the darkness, and figures moved like shadows among the trees. The enemy had underestimated the Lycan king's return, but they would not make that mistake again. The battle began silently, like a storm breaking across the land. The king moved with a fluidity and power that reminded even the widow of the legends whispered about him. His golden eyes glowed, reflecting the moonlight, and his movements were precise, fierce, and commanding. The widow, though untrained in combat, felt a surge of power she did not fully understand. When arrows flew toward them, her hands glowed faintly, and the missiles veered off course, harmlessly striking the ground. When an enemy warrior lunged, her presence alone seemed to push him back, as if the air around her had become a shield. She did not know where this strength came from. It was instinctive, tied to her bond with the king and the life she had once nurtured in quiet solitude. The rival clan was forced to retreat, overwhelmed by the unexpected coordination between the king and the widow. The soldiers whispered among themselves, eyes wide with awe. Even the king, though proud and powerful, could not hide his amazement at the widow's abilities. That night, as they returned to the castle, the king rode beside her in silence. The forest around them was quiet, and the stars seemed to shine brighter, as if acknowledging the bond that had grown even stronger through fire and danger. "You are unlike anyone I have ever known," the king said finally, his voice soft but carrying the weight of centuries. "Your courage, your strength, it is remarkable, and yet there is something more, something hidden." The widow looked down, her fingers brushing the edge of her cloak. "I do not understand it either," she admitted. "I have always lived simply, yet when I am near you, when I help, it is as if something wakes inside me, something powerful." He studied her, golden eyes intent, searching for answers he could not name. "Whatever it is," he said finally, "it saved my life. And now perhaps it will save the kingdom." Back in the castle, tensions grew. The senior counselor, who had long resented the king's decisions, now saw the widow as a threat to his influence. He whispered into the ears of others, planting seeds of doubt. The king, aware of these schemes, remained calm, but he knew a confrontation was inevitable. Late one evening, he summoned the widow to the private chamber, far from prying eyes. The room was illuminated only by a single torch, its flame flickering against the cold stone walls. "I must tell you," he said, voice quiet but urgent, "not all in this castle will welcome you. Some will try to turn me against you, and some may even seek to harm you." She met his gaze without fear. "I expected as much. I am not afraid of them nor of what comes. I only wish to protect you and to stand by your side." He nodded slowly, his expression both fierce and tender. "You have already proven your courage, but courage alone may not be enough. There are ancient forces at work, things older than the castle, older than the mountains. I can feel them moving, and I fear they may test us in ways we cannot yet imagine." Her heart quickened. "Then we face them together," she said, her voice unwavering. Days later, the castle received word of a traitor within the walls. The senior counselor had conspired with a rival faction, planning to capture the king and use the widow as leverage. The news spread like wildfire, and fear gripped the hearts of those loyal to the throne. The king did not panic. He called his closest guards and the widow to the strategy chamber. Maps were spread across the table, and candles flickered, casting shadows that danced like ghosts. "We must move carefully," the king said, tracing a finger over the borders of the kingdom. "The traitor knows our strengths, but he does not know our hearts, and he certainly does not know the bond we share." The widow listened closely, absorbing every detail. She felt the surge of magic within her, the same power that had guided her during the battle at the northern border. It was as if the castle itself recognized her strength, lending her courage and clarity. That night the king and the widow patrolled the castle in secret, moving through corridors and hidden passageways. The shadows seemed thicker, heavier, and the whispers of betrayal more pronounced. Yet with every step they grew more attuned to each other's presence, their movements synchronized in silence. At the edge of the courtyard, a figure emerged from the darkness. The widow's instincts flared and she reached out, her hands glowing faintly. The figure froze, then slowly lowered a dagger, revealing a face twisted with fear and awe. You saved him," the figure whispered, voice trembling. I thought you were a witch." The widow shook her head. "I am no witch. I am merely someone who could not turn away." The king stepped forward, golden eyes blazing. "Leave this place. You have been warned." The figure fled, disappearing into the shadows, leaving the king and the widow alone. The night was still again, but the tension lingered, a reminder that danger was never far. In the days that followed, the widow began to explore her own abilities. She discovered that her power was tied to the moon, to life, and to the energy of those she cared for. When she touched the king, she could feel his strength, his fears, his pain, and in turn he could sense hers. It was a connection beyond words, deeper than loyalty or duty, something that neither had fully understood, yet both felt with unshakable certainty. The castle itself seemed to respond to them. Shadows that had once whispered threats now recoiled at her presence. Doors opened as if guided by unseen hands, and the cold stone walls seemed to warm in her touch. She was becoming more than a healer. She was becoming a force, one that would challenge the shadows threatening the kingdom. And yet, even as their bond strengthened, a new darkness stirred. In the northern forests, hidden eyes watched the castle, recording movements, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Rival clans whispered of the Lycan king's near death and the widow's growing power. They did not know the depth of the bond between the king and the woman who had saved him, nor did they understand the strength that could emerge when courage, trust, and love intertwined. Late one evening, as the king and widow stood together on the highest tower, looking out over the moonlit mountains, he spoke softly. "We are stronger than they realize, but we cannot grow complacent. The world will test us in ways we cannot yet see." She nodded, her fingers brushing his hand. "Then we face it together, no matter what comes." A shadow moved in the distance, unseen by them but present, a silent threat that promised trials far greater than any battle or scheme. And in that moment, under the silver moon, both the king and the widow knew that their greatest challenges were still ahead. Not just the threats outside the castle walls, but the darkness within themselves and within the hearts of those they trusted. The moon rose higher, bathing the mountains in silver light. And in that light, two figures stood united, bound not only by destiny but by the impossible miracle that had brought them together. The castle seemed quieter than usual, but silence in those walls rarely meant peace. The Lycan king had regained much of his strength, yet his mind remained alert, always aware of threats lurking in shadows, always sensing the wheels of betrayal turning. The widow, now more confident in her abilities, moved through the halls with a sense of purpose, yet even she felt the tension in every stone and corner. She had grown into her role not only as the king's healer, but as his confidant, his anchor. Each day she felt her bond with him deepen. She could sense his thoughts, his fears, and even the unspoken loneliness he carried, burdens that had once been his alone for centuries. And she knew, though he did not always admit it, that he felt a connection to her unlike any he had ever known. But destiny does not allow peace for long. Late one evening, a sudden tremor shook the castle. Windows rattled and torches flickered violently. The wind carried a strange, almost unnatural chill. The king, alerted by instinct and by the widow's sudden tension, rose from his chamber. "What is happening?" he asked, eyes glowing faintly in the torchlight. The widow did not answer immediately. Her senses had been heightened over the past weeks, and now she felt it. A pulse of ancient magic, dark and deep, moving through the castle. It was not the schemes of men, nor the plotting of rival clans. It was something older, something far more dangerous. "They are here," she whispered, voice trembling slightly, "but not with swords, with something else, something powerful." The king's jaw tightened. "Prepare the guards, I will follow your lead." Together they moved through the corridors, the widow's hand lightly brushing against the walls, feeling the energy around them. The castle seemed to respond, the stones themselves humming faintly under her touch. The ancient magic was growing stronger, feeding on fear, doubt, and hidden secrets within the castle walls. They reached the highest tower, where the castle's oldest archives were kept. The widow's eyes fell on an ancient tome, its cover worn and symbols faintly glowing in the torchlight. Without thinking, she reached for it. The moment her fingers touched the book, a wave of energy surged through her, knocking her to her knees. "Are you hurt?" the king asked, rushing to her side. I think I am connected to it," she whispered. "This magic, it feels alive. It is testing me." The king's eyes softened, but there was a glimmer of concern. "Be careful. You are strong, but forces older than the mountains are at work. If this magic overwhelms you—" He did not finish the thought, but the fear in his golden eyes was clear. The widow forced herself to rise, gripping the tome. Words and symbols flowed before her eyes, revealing secrets long hidden. The power that had saved the king was tied to a bond older than the castle itself, a connection between life, the moon, and the hearts of those willing to sacrifice for another. She realized for the first time that her gift was not just healing, it was creation, protection, and transformation all at once. But using it came at a cost. That night, the king sat beside her in the archives, watching as she studied the tome. "You do not need to bear this alone," he said quietly. "We are bound together. Whatever this requires, we face it together." Her hand brushed his, and a spark of energy passed between them. She felt his strength, his fear, and his trust. She also felt a pull within herself, a calling to something greater than she had ever imagined. "I understand now," she said softly. "The power that saved you, it can save more than life, but it demands courage, and it demands sacrifice." The king nodded, eyes shining with admiration and concern. "Then we must be ready. Whatever comes, we face it together, always." The following days brought tension unlike anything the castle had known. The rival clans, emboldened by the whispers of the king's vulnerability, moved closer to the borders. The traitor within the castle grew more brazen, plotting in secret, testing the boundaries of loyalty among the guards and council. But more troubling was the ancient magic that the widow had awakened. It was alive, reactive, and hungry. One night, the magic tested her in ways that no battle or political intrigue could. While she rested in the tower, the energy within the tome flared, drawing her into a vision unlike any she had experienced. She found herself in a dark forest, the trees tall and twisted, their branches like claws. Shadows moved around her, whispering doubts, fears, and memories she had long buried. She saw herself as a young girl, alone and fearful, and then as a widow, struggling to survive after her husband's death. The magic showed her every sorrow she had endured, every moment of weakness. And then a figure emerged from the shadows, the Lycan king, wounded and helpless. His golden eyes met hers, and she felt every pain, every fear he had carried during his near death. The shadows whispered that she could not save him, that she would fail, that she was not enough. Tears streamed down her face, but she did not turn away. She reached for him, extending her hands as she had in the castle chamber weeks ago. Energy pulsed from her, silver and bright, pushing back the shadows, illuminating the dark forest. She realized in that moment that the magic was not only testing her, it was shaping her, strengthening her heart, courage, and spirit. And then the vision shifted. She saw the castle under attack, flames licking the stone walls, rival clans and traitors moving in unison to claim the king and destroy her. The vision showed the stakes. If she failed, the kingdom would fall, the king would die, and her own life would be lost. She woke with a start, the torchlight of the tower flickering around her. Her hands glowed faintly, the energy still alive within her. She realized that the test had not ended, it was only beginning. But she also knew something vital. She was stronger than she had ever believed. Her bond with the king, their trust and connection, gave her power beyond understanding. The next morning she found the king in the courtyard, practicing with his sword. His movements were precise, controlled, but there was a tension in his shoulders, a worry in his golden eyes. "You have faced the magic," he said quietly, approaching her. "How do you feel?" "I feel alive," she admitted, "and I feel ready. Whatever comes, I can face it, and I can help you face it too." He studied her, admiration and something deeper in his gaze. "You are remarkable," he said, "not just for the magic you wield, but for the courage you carry. You face more than any of us can imagine, and yet you do not falter." The day passed in preparation for the threats that loomed. Guards were briefed, defenses reinforced, and every corner of the castle checked for signs of betrayal. The widow moved quietly among them, her confidence growing, her power subtly protecting them all. Yet in the quiet moments, she felt the pull of the magic within her, urging her to explore further, to accept the full extent of her gift. That evening, she and the king stood on the highest tower once again. The moon was full, casting silver light across the mountains, forests, and the distant lands. The castle was quiet, but the widow sensed the dangers moving just beyond sight. "We are ready," she said softly, her hand brushing his. "But I know this is only the beginning. The magic, it will continue to test us, and the enemies, they will not wait." The king nodded, his golden eyes reflecting the moonlight. "Then we face it as we always have, together." But even as they stood united, a shadow moved silently through the corridors below, a whisper of betrayal that had gone unnoticed. The senior counselor, his ambition unchecked, had discovered traces of the widow's power. He saw not only the bond she shared with the king, but also the energy that pulsed through the castle in her presence, and he coveted it. Far away, in the northern forests, rival clan leaders watched the castle through enchanted telescopes, unaware of the bond that had been forged. They saw only walls, swords, and men. They did not see the connection that could change the course of kingdoms, the magic that could protect, heal, and transform. As the widow stood beside the king, feeling the pulse of life and magic flowing between them, she realized a truth she could not ignore. The trials ahead would not be fought with swords alone. They would test her courage, her heart, and her soul. And the bond she shared with the king would be both her greatest strength and her deepest vulnerability. The castle was quiet that night, but the air was thick with anticipation. Magic hummed in the stones, in her hands, in the connection that tied them both together. And in the shadows, forces old and dark waited, knowing that the widow's power had awakened and that it could change everything. She turned to the king, his golden gaze steady upon her. "Whatever comes next," she whispered, "we face it together. No matter the danger, no matter the cost." He nodded, taking her hand in his, a spark of silver energy passing between them. "Always," he said. Outside, the moonlit mountains glimmered in the full moon's glow, a silent witness to courage, love, and the impossible miracles that had brought them together. And somewhere beyond the reach of torchlight and stone, shadows stirred, preparing to test the widow's courage, the king's strength, and the bond that held them both together. This was not the end. It was only the beginning of a trial that would demand everything from them: their hearts, their courage, and the impossible power that had chosen them. Dawn broke over the moonlit mountains, painting the castle in gold and silver. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and earth, but beneath the beauty, tension coiled like a serpent. The widow stood on the highest tower, the wind tugging at her cloak, her heart steady despite the storm of emotions within her. Today, the trials would come together, the test of her power, the kingdom's survival, and the destiny she shared with the Lycan king. The king approached, moving with strength and confidence that had returned fully in the past days. His golden eyes were calm but alert, scanning the horizon, as though sensing threats invisible to others. The wound that had nearly ended his life was nothing more than a faint scar now. His near death had forged a deeper understanding between them, a connection that went beyond words, beyond trust, beyond fear. "They will come," he said quietly, joining her at the tower's edge. "The traitor, the clans, and perhaps even forces older than this kingdom." She nodded, hands brushing the cold stone. "Then we face them together. We have no choice." He took her hand, and for a moment the world seemed to hold its breath. The castle below was a maze of towers and corridors, filled with soldiers ready for battle, Yet the true test lay not in swords or shields. It lay in courage, heart, and the strength to face what was unimaginable. The first sign of danger came from the castle itself. The senior counselor, his ambition now unchecked, revealed his betrayal. Guards loyal to him moved silently through the corridors, intent on capturing the king and using the widow's mysterious powers as leverage. The widow felt the pulse of danger like a vibration in her chest. The magic that had guided her, tested her, and strengthened her was alive now, responsive to the threats. She stepped forward, her hands glowing faintly with silver light. The walls of the castle seemed to hum in response, as if acknowledging her courage and will. The king followed, sword in hand, moving with grace and authority. Together, they confronted the traitor in the great hall. The counselor's eyes widened as he saw the widow's aura, the strange silver energy surrounding her. He tried to summon guards to attack, but the magic responded instantly. Doors slammed shut, corridors shifted, and shadows seemed to form walls around him containing his plans. "You overestimated your cunning," the king said, his voice calm but filled with power. "And you underestimated her strength." The widow did not speak, but her energy radiated in waves, gentle yet unstoppable. She extended her hand, and the counselor, despite his anger and ambition, felt an overwhelming sense of truth pressing upon him, a reminder of loyalty, courage, and consequence. His guards, seeing the impossible, faltered. Fear rooted them in place. The king moved forward, restraining the counselor with firm authority. "You sought to betray your king," he said. "But this castle, these walls, and the people within them are bound by more than power. They are bound by courage and trust." The counselor sank to his knees, defeated, the magic surrounding him dissolving. I did not understand," he whispered, fear and awe mingling in his voice. "You sought control," the widow said softly, her silver aura fading but still warm around her hands. "But control without heart is nothing." The castle was quiet, almost reverent. The soldiers and courtiers looked upon the widow with a mixture of awe, fear, and respect. She had not only saved the king, she had protected the kingdom, exposed treachery, and shown a power that none could deny or challenge. But the day's trials were not yet over. From the northern forests, rival clans had seen the disturbance in the castle's energy. They advanced swiftly, thinking the king's near death had left him weak. Yet when they approached, they found not a wounded ruler but a united kingdom, strengthened by courage, trust, and the widow's emerging power. The battle was fierce but unlike any previous conflicts. The king led with strength, strategy, and instinct. The widow, her hands glowing with energy drawn from the life force of the castle and the bond she shared with him, moved among the soldiers, shielding, guiding, and strengthening them. Arrows missed their marks, weapons seemed to falter before her presence, and soldiers found courage they did not know they had. The rival clans, though strong and determined, could not overcome the unity and power displayed by the king and the widow. One by one, they were forced to retreat, realizing that the castle was defended not only by swords and shields, but by something far older and stronger, a bond of courage, magic, and love. After the battle, the castle was quiet again. The sun had climbed higher, bathing the stones in golden light. Soldiers and courtiers moved among the halls, tending to wounds, restoring order and whispering of the miraculous events. And at the heart of it all, the king and the widow stood together, their hands intertwined, their bonds solidified by trials that had tested them beyond imagination. The king looked at her, golden eyes soft but fierce. "You have changed everything," he said. "Not just for me, but for the kingdom, for everyone who calls this castle home. You are extraordinary." She shook her head, a faint smile on her lips. "I am merely someone who could not stand aside. You would have done the same for me." He took her hands fully in his, feeling the pulse of energy that had saved him, protected the castle, and strengthened the kingdom. "No," he said firmly. "I have lived centuries, faced enemies and death countless times. I have never seen anyone like you. Your courage, your power, your heart. You are unique, and I will never let you go." For the first time in his life, the Lycan king allowed himself to feel something beyond duty, beyond fear, beyond strategy. He allowed himself to feel trust, admiration, and love, pure and unguarded. And the widow, who had known loss, struggle, and hardship, felt the warmth of belonging, of purpose, and of a bond that would last beyond the edges of life and death. The castle, too, seemed to recognize the shift. Walls no longer whispered threats, shadows no longer lurked with suspicion, and the air itself felt lighter, filled with quiet power and peace. The magic that had tested the widow, that had pushed her to the edge, now rested within her, tempered and strong, a reflection of the courage and trust she had shared with the king. In the evening, as the sun set behind the moonlit mountains, the king and widow stood on the tower once more. The world below was quiet, and the castle had never felt more alive. "You have done the impossible," he said softly, eyes reflecting the fiery sky. "You saved me when no one else could. You saved this kingdom when it was weakest, and you have proven that even in the darkest moments, courage and heart can prevail." She looked at him, her heart full of emotion. "We did it together. You trusted me and I trusted you. That is what made it possible." He pulled her close, his hands steady and protective. "Then we face the future together," he said. "No matter what comes. The world may test us again, but I know now that we are stronger than anything that tries to break us." For a long moment they stood there, the wind tugging at their cloaks, the mountains glowing in the last light of day. And in that silence they understood something neither had fully realized before. Their bond, forged in fear, courage, and life itself, was unbreakable. It was more than trust, more than loyalty, more than love. It was destiny. The night fell, and stars sparkled over the moonlit mountains, witnesses to the miracles, courage, and transformations that had occurred within the castle walls. The rival clans had retreated, the traitor was contained, and the kingdom was safe for now. But more importantly, two souls had found each other, had faced the impossible together, and had emerged stronger, wiser, and united. The widow leaned against the king, feeling the warmth of his presence, the rhythm of his heartbeat, and the unspoken promise between them. "Whatever comes next," she whispered, "we face it together." "Always," he replied, golden eyes glowing faintly under the moonlight. "Always." And in the quiet of the castle, under the watchful gaze of mountains, forests, and stars, the Lycan king and the widow knew this truth. Courage, trust, and heart could overcome even the oldest magic, the deepest shadows, and the greatest dangers. And together they were unstoppable. The kingdom would remember this day, not only for the battles won or the traitor's defeat, but for the bond that had changed everything, that had proven that even in the darkest times, the impossible could be achieved. The moon rose high, silver light spilling across towers, walls, and streets. Somewhere in the distance, the wind carried whispers of hope, courage, and new beginnings. The Lycan king, once near death, stood fully alive. And the widow, once ordinary and unseen, had become extraordinary. Together they had rewritten destiny. And as they stood on the highest tower, hands entwined, hearts united, and the kingdom safe beneath them, one truth remained unshakable. Their story was only just beginning.